Okay. So thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today. I don't have any nice animal pictures or horrible animal pictures. So you'll find this presentation is a little bit more flat than Taylor's. So, but it's I guess you would say a slightly more theoretical or philosophical or slightly more abstract version of a response to many of the issues that Taylor has laid so nicely on the proverbial table. Again, I'm Stefan Dolgert. I'm a professor here in political science, and what I do is political theory, political philosophy. Did any of you do political science as an undergraduate major? Okay, so a couple of you. What majors do most of you come from? Did you do environmental as a major as an undergraduate? My fault. So mainly, the reason I ask that is just mainly I think when a lot of folks think about political science, they think about more kind of empirical work. A lot of what's done in political science is really statistical analysis and statistical analysis of how institutions work, what causes institutions to run in a more optimal fashion using sort of large data sets. So that's not the part of political science that I do, just to be clear about that. So I'm more on the kind of philosophic wing or theoretical wing. So in thinking about many of the issues that Taylor laid out, in political science, in political theory, oops, there we go. So we try to think about how we might create, construct, conceive of institutions, political institutions, that could actually respond to the environmental degradation as well as the systemic cruelty. So we call it both the practical problems of our own self-interest as caused by global warming, as caused by animal agriculture, as well as problems of morality and ethics that are raised by the presentation Taylor has given us. So how might we think about convening a public or sets of public institutions that could adequately respond to these problems, that could actually take account of them in a way? There is a branch of political philosophy, political theory, that looks at deliberation and looks at various deliberative sorts of bodies, deliberative democracy, as a means of thinking about, okay, well, how can we get better outcomes or better solutions? How can we take better account of what's going on? What we need is more rational systems of deliberation. How can we obtain a true accounting of costs and benefits to all of those involved? So humans and non-humans, humans here, humans in the Maldives who will soon be underwater because of global warming, right? Maldives Islands, the Marshall Islands will be underwater in probably, 50 years. So Val Plumwood, who was an environmental political philosopher and deliberative democratic theorist, Val Plumwood talked about ecological rationality and how we might think about creating deliberative institutions that would embody an ecological rationality, so rationality that is sensitive to a larger ecological context. Plumwood says one of the key problems, and this is connected with what Taylor was talking about, one of the key problems that she identifies is the problem of remoteness. So remoteness is, and she describes three kinds of remoteness. Remoteness, consequential, epistemic, and temporal. Plumwood says consequential remoteness occurs because the people who are making the decisions, that is us, but it's not just us, of course, who are making decisions politically, it's a very small subset of economic and political elites. They are remote from the consequences of their actions. So they are remote from the ecological consequences of their actions. They don't live in the Maldives Islands, so they don't give a crap if the Maldives Islands go underwater. What difference does it make? They're remote from the consequences, and they're not pigs or cows, so they don't care about that either. So they are remote, they don't suffer the consequences. The costs are externalized onto other nations, other peoples, other creatures, non-human animals primarily. This is, she says, a consequence in part of what she calls epistemic or communicative remoteness. So those who are most affected by these actions, by these industries, are epistemically disempowered. So the people who are most affected by these environmental consequences and the animals don't have a ready means of communicating the things they know. And this could be, we could talk about the things that human beings know, but we could also talk about the things that animal bodies know in terms of how they are being treated. So their suffering is not able to be communicated to those who are remote from the consequences of this suffering. So there's an epistemic remoteness. Finally, Plumwood talks about temporal remoteness, which is connected in a way to consequential remoteness. That is, in particular, when we think about environmental consequences, most of these consequences are 50 years, 100 years down the line. And so humans now especially are temporally removed from the consequences of their actions. A professor, a political theorist named Terence Ball put it this way. He said, essentially what we're doing is we today are planting time bombs. We're like terrorists. We are planting pollution time bombs that will detonate in 50 years and 100 years and 200 years. And at that time, there's not going to be anyone to blame in a sense, because we will, of course, already be dead. But when the real environmental effects are taking place, it's sort of the equivalent of bombs going off. We today are worried about bombs going off in Paris, as we should be. I'm not suggesting the terrorist attacks in Paris were trivial, but we focus on that sort of thing, but we don't focus on what we could think of as a kind of real ecological terrorism, but it's we who are the terrorists doing things that we think are normal and natural, and not intending to destroy the world 100 and 200 years hence. But in effect, that's what we're doing. So Plumwood and others say, how can we convene a public that will attend to these problems? How can we think about that? So remoteness reduction is, for Plumwood and others, one of the key goals. So how can we get institutions that will remove, or not remove, but reduce the remoteness, the three kinds of remoteness that she talked about? With our current institutions, it is highly unlikely that we will actually take account of remoteness, that we will actually try to reduce remoteness. Bruno Latour, and Latour is the main theorist I'm going to talk about, the main philosopher I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time. French sociologist, anthropologist, and philosopher. Has anyone heard of Bruno Latour by chance? No. So he's, okay, good. I think I know why you've heard of him. Yeah. Latour is famous for a lot of reasons. If you've ever heard of anything called the Science Wars, which took place in the sort of 80s and 90s, this was basically criticism directed at the impartiality of the sciences. Latour was part of this, this conflict, although he was never opposed to science. Well, anyway, I won't talk about that. So Latour, so I'm going to give you a kind of précis, a little summary of Latour's way of thinking about why our current institutions won't take account of the problem that, well, of the problems that Taylor laid out, and then the kind of problem that Val Plumwood laid out, this need to reduce remoteness. Our institutions aren't going to do this, Latour says. They won't do this because they're based on a false split between politics and nature. And he says, and he's got a long, complicated story, and I'm not going to give you the complicated story about this, but according to Latour, we actually, if we go back in time to the Greek philosophers, if we go back in time to Plato, actually, we are the inheritors of a tradition in which politics and nature were split off from each other. The idea, Latour says in this philosophic tradition, is that politics is the world of interests and competition and rhetoric. It's the world of marketing. People are always trying to persuade you to do something that's in their interest. They're trying to manipulate you. That's the world of politics. And it's a realm of illusion. So nothing is really real in politics. Everything is a social construct. We're creating the world in which we want to live, and it's just different people making arguments for what that world is going to be. But it's not about reality. Latour says the Greek philosophers like Plato said that's the problem with the world. The problem with the world is everybody's a marketer, everybody's a sophist, everybody's a rhetorician, just trying to persuade you basically to give in to your desires and to do what you feel like. And they're trying to tell you how you should sort of buy the things that they want to sell. Plato's solution to this, and Latour says we all sort of follow Plato in this. The solution to this is that we carve off this realm of nature, or you could think of it as the real world, not the MTV real world. Maybe there was one year where they actually got to this. The Puck and Pedro year, they actually got to the real world that year. Otherwise, it's not a real world. I know I'm dating myself because it's not even like the real world isn't even on anymore, right? Is that right? It's not on anymore. I don't think so. No, I think it's been on for a while. Anyway, but when I was a kid, I was watching the real world. So Latour says what Plato does and what the philosophers and what the scientists today, our scientists are heirs to this tradition. They say, look, there is a real world. It's the world of physics and chemistry and biology. Gravity's a real thing. You can't just wish it away because it's politically inconvenient. There's a real world out there, and the way to access it is through, it used to be through philosophy 2,000 years ago. Now the way to access this real world of nature, and it's nature with a capital N, is through science. So Latour says what we have is a split between our political institutions that just deal with illusions, that just deal with the world of social construct and the world of values. And everyone's values are relative, so this is a realm of infinite argument. Nature is the world of facts. Nature is the world of physical facts, biological facts, etc. But those two worlds are separate because Latour says we don't have a good way of connecting what the experts in the sciences do and know and claim to believe about the real world with our political institutions. Political institutions prefer to just deal with socially constructed reality. So Latour says we have a split between our scientific institutions that claim to tell us about what the real world is and our political institutions that in many ways are not interested in what the scientists actually have to say. So what Latour wants us to do, and what Latour is essentially saying is, we can't take account of the real world problems that Taylor has drawn our attention to, given our current institutions. Because we have a world of scientific experts on the one hand, and on the other hand, a world of politicians, and they aren't able to actually come together in any intelligent way. He says that once you split these two groups off, you can't solve for a problem like the connection between animal agriculture and global warming. Because on the one hand, you get people who say, well, you want to tell me to eat differently, that's just your values talking. And I have different values. And this is the world of politics. And so I have my different values and you have your different values, and we'll just have our competing interest groups. But don't tell me that that's reality. That's not about reality. This is just about values. On the other hand, if you sort of come at it from a different angle, or you get skepticism from a different angle, which is those who are economists today, and economists are scientists in Latour's sense, economists say, look, you can't go about changing the world of global capitalism because global capitalism is a natural organism. It functions the same way. It functions according to laws of evolution and laws of nature, the laws of supply and demand, and the nature of the invisible hand that regulates the free market of capitalism. Those things are immutable or more or less fixed laws of nature. So those economists, and this is the predominant, we could say the weight of economists are on the side of capitalism in these matters. They say, I'm not saying there aren't environmentally or ecologically sensitive economists, but that is not by and large what economists do as a discipline today. The economists say, don't bring your values into our science. What our science says is the laws of capitalism are immutable. Don't try to fix it with your values. So again, what we have is this split between politics and values on the one hand and science and facts on the other. And Latour says they're not able to come together to actually handle the challenges that we've been talking about. They're not able to actually come up with ecologically rational decision-making processes. So what Latour says, and this is again just a very brief snapshot of Latour's proposal. He proposes a kind of thought experiment, which he calls the Parliament of Things, or the collective. The Parliament of Things is going to be, again, this is a kind of thought experiment for thinking about what a political, deliberative, decision-making institution should be doing. It's going to be a bicameral legislature, just as we have here, just as they have in the US, an upper and a lower house, a House of Representatives and a Senate, if you will. And in this Parliament of Things, and according to Latour, parenthesis, everything is a thing. So you're a thing, I'm a thing, these chairs are things, the prions that cause bovine spongiform encephalopathy, that is mad cow disease, prions are things, cows are things, British thermal units, so energy expenditure, carbon, greenhouse gases, all of these are things. So when Latour is saying a parliament of things, he means bringing together a collective in which all things, he also refers to these being as actants. That is, all things are agentic in a certain way. Carbon has a certain, carbon released as a greenhouse gas, or methane as a greenhouse gas, is an agent in the world. It changes the world as it's being released. Human beings are agents, cows are agents, prions, bacteria, viruses are agents. So these actants can be living beings, but they can also be inorganic matter that is nevertheless still actually active in the world, changing the world in unpredictable ways. So what Latour is trying to do is say, we need a way of accounting for all of how all of these different beings, all of these different things are interacting with each other. So us and our gut bacteria and cows and prions and greenhouse gases and cereal crops. So what he says we're going to do, that we should sort of ideally be trying to do, is convene a parliament of things structured around two questions. One house, the lower house, will ask the question, how many of us are there? The upper house will ask the question, how shall we get along? So the idea would be that all beings, or all actants, need to be represented in some sense to appear or called before this new parliament to say who actually exists in the world. So, are prions things in the world? Are quarks things in the world? Are cows things in the world that we need to take account of in some way? Are human beings in all of their difference something that need to be accounted for? All of these beings would have to go through a process whereby their existence is recognized. So from Latour's standpoint, what's useful about this is that it flattens the horizon for everybody initially. So if you begin to ask questions, political questions, based on this sort of two-tiered set of questions, you don't get to do the following. Okay, so how many of you know about what's going on with the organization is Toronto Pig Save, but what's the actual pig facility that the protests are taking place at?
It's Fearman's Pork Incorporated in
Okay.
Burlington.
So do you know about the activist who is being charged with, what's the actual charge?
Criminal mischief.
Criminal mischief for giving water to pigs. Does anyone not know about this? Okay. So during a protest in front of this pork facility where activists are there, and there's a truck of pigs waiting to go into the slaughterhouse, a woman gives in a water bottle. She possibly reaches into the truck. That's part of the legal issue. Does the water bottle cross the frontier into the truck or not? Or does the pig's snout come out? So she's being charged with criminal mischief in this case for just giving water to these pigs. It's, what's the Ontario law? Is it 72 hours that they're allowed to not have? So Ontario law is now that it's okay if you have pigs and you're sending them to a slaughterhouse, you don't have to give them water for the final 72 hours of their life. That's totally fine. All right, 3 days they can not have water. Totally legal. So this activist is being charged with criminal mischief. From the standpoint of Latour's Parliament of Things, okay, sorry, let me back up one stage further. So the justification for this is those pigs are not actants, they're not beings endowed with rights, they're property. And so this is interfering with the property of another person, right? That's the primary way this is thought of. Under Latour's system, you don't get to automatically say certain kinds of creatures are property and other kinds of creatures are the property owners. You flatten everything out and you bring all the beings up before this parliament to sort of decide who exists here and then how shall the arrangements be decided? How shall these beings get along? Now, it's conceivable that in this system that Latour proposes, that the pigs could, at the end of the day, still be relegated to property. That is a conceivable outcome because this is a process for thinking about how deliberation should occur, and it doesn't mandate how things are going to end up. It doesn't mandate who's going to get rights. And so for some activists, some critical animal rights folks are not satisfied with this kind of proposal that I'm sketching. And although I'm sketching this proposal for you, they have good reasons to be concerned. So I take seriously their concerns. But I think what's useful about this is that it gives us a kind of heuristic or a model of thinking about a political institution that could result in a more, let's say, equitable distribution, and it could result in institutions that would be able to account for the rights of beings who currently don't get any rights. So, how many of us are there? How should we get along? These are the way these institutions would function. If this sounds like total sort of theoretical philosophical lunacy, it might be, but there are some real-world connections here. So there's something called the Loweswater Care Project in the UK that is a model of environmental deliberative sort of stakeholder decision-making that is in part inspired by what Latour has sketched out. And so if you're interested, there's one site to go have a look at. Suvalis is the primary researcher in this. Just sort of really briefly, what they try to do with this Loweswater Care Project is Loweswater is a lake, I think, and there was a blue-green algae problem. And so what they convened was a kind of Parliament of Things. Not officially, the state didn't do this, like the British government didn't do this. The people in the Loweswater area came together, farmers and scientists and conservationists and people who were fishing in this lake came together to try to take a kind of census of who all is going on, who all is involved here in this sort of little microcosm, this lake, and how can we make more ecologically rational decisions by bringing all the stakeholders together. So if you've ever talked, you probably have talked about kind of stakeholder democracy or stakeholder decision making with environmental decision making. It's in that vernacular, but they also make these connections with Latour. Our critique of this, and I should say that I'm working on a grant proposal right now with another professor in sociology, Professor Lauren Corman. So we're working on a grant proposal that is based in this idea of Latour's about convening a parliament of things, and we're trying to do this here at Brock. So we're trying to create a Brock parliament of things, the first stages of. Our critique of the Loweswater example, which is a good example, and it's useful to help us think through some of the practical problems. Excuse me. One of our concerns is that it's too problem focused, and by that I mean the Loweswater example only takes off because there was a perception that there was a problem with the blue-green algae bloom in this lake that was causing problems for mainly for recreational uses for fishermen, primarily I think in the lake. So it sort of only comes into the world as a thing. There's a sort of parliament of things convened around this case because of this problem that these recreational fishers are trying to, or that these recreational fishers encounter. What we would like to do is think about creating an institution or a parliament that's trying to account for all the beings who are involved. Who counts as a being? Who counts as someone who's a someone who should be accounted for and whose rights should be talked about? In this case, and in cases that are inspired by this, the idea is not that there would be any kind of pre-existing institution that would be trying to take an account of who all gets to count, but instead it relies on someone saying, hey, there's a problem here, and then let's try to figure something out. So what we would like to do is create an institution that has a kind of standing independent of a problem. In the same way, for instance, that we don't think about Parliament today requiring a problem before people send representatives on the way, right? So we have a standing institution that's there to take account of things. We don't think it takes account of things very well when it comes to greenhouse gases, animal agriculture, animal cruelty. But nevertheless, the institution is a standing institution, right? We think about, the Congress, House of Representatives and the Senate in the U.S. or our legislature here, the institution is sort of always there. So that's one of the things that we want, is an institution that's there, that's always kind of ready to try to solve problems because it's on the lookout for problems. And we're also concerned that in the Loweswater example, there's not enough attention to non-human beings as ethical subjects. So in that particular case, there's not a whole lot of concern with whether the fish really particularly want to be fished. So it's still a little too human-centered from our perspective. But we think the idea of this institution, the idea of this Parliament of Things, can take account of non-human agents as ethical subjects. It's just this particular case doesn't do it as much as we would like. Okay, so what we're trying to do is we think that it's a good idea to try to start up a census at Brock University. So that's what we're trying to do with this grant project. So essentially we want to account for all the beings, the actants at Brock University, just as a start, just as a kind of pilot project, right? So humans, non-human animals, so that's animals in laboratories, that's rats and squirrels, in the trees out here. That's bacteria, that's energy that's being used, electricity that's being brought in, it's greenhouse gases that are being produced, it's how many BTUs of energy are being expended to heat and light every office, every room. It's the food that's being consumed here. It's the greenhouse gases being produced by the cars and the buses that are coming here. It's all of this. I mean, so the idea is to try to get as comprehensive a census as possible. Again, this is just a stage one of this project of convening the Parliament of Things. And so what we're going to be doing is looking for the way the kind of methodology of the project is going to work is we're going to be looking for representatives to help us account for who's here. So this was on a prior slide and I didn't mention this. For Latour, what Latour says is there's no reality without representation. This is his way of bringing politics and nature together. So we only know about natural entities in the world because there are experimental procedures or people who in some way represent those entities. So quarks don't exist in the world until you have an experimental apparatus that demonstrates that there's something like a quark in the world. So that's what Latour calls, that's a representative device. And so in order to make anything present to the Parliament of Things, whether it's bacteria, whether it's prions, whether it's greenhouse gases, whether it's quarks, whether it's the animals who are being experimented on here, you need someone to represent those beings. One crucial thing that Latour says is these representatives are not unimpeachable. So, for instance, well, in his terminology, representatives might be unfaithful. Here's an example of this. So there are various animals in laboratories here at Brock. The way that they would appear in the Parliament of Things is the biologists who are working on these animals would be one set of representatives who would say, here are the amphibians that we're doing work on. We are their representatives. But they're not the only representatives of those amphibians. There will also be other people, a Brock Animal Rights, Student Animal Rights group, who will say, no, we are actually the representatives of those creatures, not you. We are more authentic representatives than the researchers. So the idea of us going and looking for representatives and then, so essentially we would be talking to people, researchers, administrative officials at Brock, but also students, student groups, also other interested faculty. The idea is we're not going to be going to one set of researchers and saying, okay, you get carte blanche to speak for whatever creatures you want to speak for. So what this notion of looking for representatives who might be unfaithful, what's wrapped up in this